Funding for New Mexico in Focus provided by the McCune Charitable Foundation. And viewers like you.
This week on New Mexico in Focus, confronting the rising threat of violence against New Mexico's Asian American Pacific Islander communities.
The feeling of sorrow, the feeling of grief, the feeling of pain was just overwhelming.
Plus, the importance of representation in local media with Albuquerque's first African American general manager. New Mexico in Focus starts now. Thanks for joining us this week. I'm your host, Gene Grant. Healthcare has definitely been the story of the last year, but amidst all the COVID-19 pandemic and public health response, many may have missed the news that the University of New Mexico Hospital is opening the state's first ever comprehensive stroke center. Ahead this week, we find out more about what this means for patients across New Mexico, and a little later, we'll introduce you to Lori Walden, the general manager and president of KOAT TV, as she and I discuss why now is the time to pay more than lip service to diversity in the media. But up first is a story we've been covering for a while now here on New Mexico in Focus, and the threat became all the more real with the news of the recent deaths of 6 people in an apparent hate crime in Atlanta. It's just one of a series of escalating assaults directed at Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, including right here in New Mexico. To gain more perspective on how bad it has gotten and what we can do to turn the tide, I recently reached out to some members of the local Asian American community. There's a lot of things we need to get to, a lot of issues that have been out there in the public consciousness about Asian Americans, people from the Pacific Islands, that has just got to stop. This violence against women, 70% of the folks reported to be assaulted lately, Asian Americans, are women, 70%. I mean, this is just getting wildly out of control, and we need to talk about this as a people. So I want to thank you, Crystal, for joining me. I know this is obviously not a great fun time to be talking about these things, but let me ask you this straight away. How did you feel right from the top when it wasn't immediately said by the authorities, the police, everybody else in Atlanta and in Fulton County? No one just went there and said it was a hate crime. People just sort of tapped their feet for a little while. How did that? I'm curious your reaction to that.
I was livid. I definitely dropped an F-bomb or several. It was funny. So I got the breaking news update the Tuesday night when it had happened. And at first I didn't actually report that the mass shooting had involved Asian Americans.
Right.
And at first I was like, wow, that's really sad. You know, that there's the subject of mass shootings is back in the news considering the pandemic, right? Mm-hmm. So if you think about it, it's the first mass shooting that we've had since lockdown, right? Yeah. And then Wednesday morning, the Asian Business Collaborative, which I'm the volunteer executive director for, one of our team members was like, guys, this isn't good. And it was heartbreaking to hear. And all of a sudden I got messages of support and saying, how do you feel? Are you all right? I'm thinking of you. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure that, you know, immediately I went straight to my team. I was like, how are you guys doing? Are you guys okay? And the feeling of sorrow, the feeling of grief, the feeling of pain was just overwhelming. And then I read the article and I saw the interview from the police chief that said that this individual just had a bad day and it wasn't categorized as a hate crime. And I started screaming, saying that this is absolutely a hate crime because how I know that our Asian culture has dealt with so much grief and so much trauma when it came to the exploitation and sexualization of our women. Mm-hmm. In fact, I used to joke and say that I was a mail order bride just to kind of get a kick out of it. And there was that one time that my mom heard that joke and she was like, I worked way too damn hard to overtake that stereotype. And that was my mistake of falling into that whitewashed culture of being okay with saying things like that. And there's definitely that conversation of what is the responsibility of our community to know that that sexualization of Asian women is not okay. I think the part for me that did it, that gets me still to this day is like, I always think about the aspect of the business owner, right? And there was 2 businesses that were affected by this, the Gold Spa and the Young Asians Massage. in Georgia, and I was speaking to a group I was speaking with a grief group that we all got together thanks to the National Asian National Asian and Pan American Women's Forum that deals with this exact topic of sexualization and exploitation of Asian women. In the Asian American Association, I was speaking in that grief group, and what I said to them is what I'm sharing with you now. The part that hurts the most is the screaming of the employees, like how they went to work one day because they had, what do we do best as Asian Americans? We provide for our families, and they were just simply providing for their family that day, and they were killed. I even told, so many of the different people that I work with and the different organizations I support, I said, I wouldn't be able to live with myself if my team was killed under my watch. And I can't imagine what that would be for the Asian business owners. And just to hear the women just being killed, and they're so helpless at that time. It's not fair. It's not fair about what happened with them just simply because a guy had a bad day. And so I thought that was total BS of what the chief said. And I don't think we as an Asian community will ever forgive him for what he said, and not even drawing the conclusion that this could definitely be a part of the reason. This is part of the national sentiment of what we feel about the Asian community, and how we've all had to defend the fact that it's the Chinese virus, and how that was a terrible term, and how the root of the problem is the person. Well, it's also the community that believes in it too, and so it's been frustrating, and I think if there was a silver lining, about the situation, it's the fact that the Asian community has been the most vocal that they ever have been in the last 2 to 3 weeks. And I'm really proud that, our ancestors have told us to be quiet and say it is what it is. But I think that now our community has just redefined that it's definitely time to speak up and actually advocate for Asians, because it's not okay.
Your sense of what you're seeing, we'll talk local here in a minute, but let's talk the broader issue of why this is happening in the first place. But then also awareness. I'm annoyed that there just doesn't seem to be enough awareness of this issue, even given the numbers I just sort of laid out. You would think this would be front page news across the country. Why isn't it?
I think we're watching what we're seeing it's deeply saddening, but it's also not at all surprising, because this kind of white supremacy has always benefited from xenophobia and this kind of behavior. And I think that we've seen this kind of violence committed towards our communities for a long time, even before the coronavirus. And I think there's also the model minority myth, which is a myth that, talks about Asians being like the best minority and not actually targeted by a lot of this kind of violence. But because of that myth, I think that is a huge reason why this isn't widespread knowledge, and this isn't seen as something that is important to talk about or see or notice, and it isn't top of the news regularly until now.
We're just tired of seeing the disrespect towards our grandparents, towards our parents, towards our elders. And we are sometimes even going against the norm of what we're used to as an Asian culture, which is actually speaking up. The amount of respect that is ingrained in a lot of our different cultures is so deep that we are just, I think our generation of Asians now, the second and third generation, we're just tired of it. And also, we have to give credit to the communities of color that started to stand up for themselves, because it started to open up those pathways. Even though I'm glad that those communities of color have opened those avenues for us, I'm also surprised that they haven't banded closer together with us too. And I don't know if that's us as an Asian community in New Mexico that needs to not be as divided, or if whether or not, our legislators, our communities, our loud leaders, our key influencers in our market need to stop thinking that it's only two major minority groups in New Mexico. In fact, it's actually 3, and that's Asian, Hispanic, and Black. Or 4, I'm sorry, Native, Asian, Hispanic, and Black. Like, we're here too.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point. And let's, Ms. Watasi, you know, this problem goes back to the 19th and 20th centuries. It's not as if this is like a 2020 problem that, you know, suddenly we're all sort of like, we don't know how this has been happening. So you've got something going on for so long. I would have expected that when you've got this level of violence, this level of stress, this level of things happening in a community, that to Crystal's point, other communities would rally at this point. Would you like to see something like that happen as well?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think it's really important for our communities to come together and support each other when this kind of violence occurs. And I think violence against any racial group is violence against all of these racial groups. And I think it's incredibly important that we are there in solidarity with one another. I mean, we've seen, of course, so much anti-Black racism in this country, and it is also our responsibility as Asian Americans and Asians to be working in solidarity with that movement. I think it is, you know, violence against any group based on their race or ethnicity or language ability or color of their skin is incredibly, incredibly damaging to our communities. So, yeah, I think it would be great if, you know, we all rally together and fight all of these kinds of forms of violence.
Are you getting reports, any local situations here at the organization? Are you getting complaints?
Yeah, I mean, we always have, like, our agency is a direct service agency, so we work closely with the community on, you know, victims of crime, victims of domestic violence or sexual violence, you know, providing basic access to basic needs, resource navigation, et cetera. And so we do have a lot of clients who come to us and share with us instances of violence towards them. And we've seen this not just recently, but for years, including racism towards Muslim women on the public transportation, harassment where people do not step in and do not intervene. We've seen, you know, recently a client who works at a massage parlor and one of the clients refused to put on a mask and then physically assaulted our client. And, you know, we've seen a lot of these kinds of forms of harassment, vandalism on the Taste of India restaurant in Albuquerque around like 4 times last year, I think. You know, there's so many instances of this, and we've seen it come up time and time again.
Mm-hmm. You know,
to comment,
please.
Sorry, and to comment on the Asian business community perspective, the Taste of India situation was an example of how local leaders started to recognize that there needed to be change. In fact, APD reached out to the Asian Business Collaborative, asking to say, how can we support these Asian businesses, especially with the crimes that are ridden? And so we reached out, ABC reached out to the Taste of India, and they said, you know, we're just frustrated that we have to take matters into our own hands. Right. And, you know, security and protocol has just been so difficult, especially for a small business. But what people don't understand is that some of these small business owners, this is their paycheck, this is their livelihood. They're not, you know, the highly educated, or they may be the highly educated, you know, Asians that we hear about in demographics and statistics, but they're still making a living off of their businesses. And then to add the racial discrimination on top of that just makes a really unhealthy situation.
Yeah, exactly right. You know, I keep thinking about, Crystal, this idea of Asian Americans being perceived as the, you know, perpetual, you know, foreigners. Like, you know what I mean? Like, not quite Americans. You hear this kind of foolishness from, you know, ignorant people all the time. I don't understand how this has continued to last in our country. I honestly, it just really, you know, the level of ignorance on display here when you've got 90-year-olds being assaulted because of a pandemic. I mean, how do you punch through to someone like that's willing to assault an elder, for gosh sake? I mean, is it jail time? Is it, you know, education? What's the way?
I think about the actual founder of the New Mexico Asian Family Center, and she was my aunt, she was my mentor, which is Dr. Adelamar Alcantara, or Auntie Deli, as many of us in the Asian community know. And I think she answered this best when she won the Si Se Puede Award during the Cesar Chavez celebration before she passed away. And she says, our generation, meaning the second and third generation, has to fight. We have to fight back. We have to say something. We have to make that institutional change against racism, because those elders that are consistently being threatened, if they were not grown, they were not influenced to speak up the way that we are, especially in our communities. And so I think about that speech so much because it's just resonated with me. And it became a big part of the Asian Family Center when she started it, because she was just tired of seeing how so many people were discriminated just because, and the domestic violence issues and the sexual assault issues and the persecutions that they would constantly receive. And also too, I think it's awareness. Education and awareness is a big thing. And myself and along with Khalil, one of the Mexico PBS contributors, he had asked me the same question of like, what do you do whenever you have communities that are trying to learn about diversity, but they don't know how to address it and they don't know what to do to make that change? I say educate yourself. Educate yourself on a situation where that you're willing to make a change, and you're willing to spend the time to learn more about the culture, rather than just saying, I have a cousin, or I'm married to a Japanese person, or I'm married to a Filipina, so I know about the culture.
Right.
That's not the case. It's take the time to actually better educate yourself.
Let me go back to something that we can't breeze over, and Crystal mentioned this, and that is the rhetoric that started this whole thing from our previous president, those incendiary comments. It can't be let go for this conversation, because that is really where a lot of this started. And I mentioned the Stop AAPI hate site, and there's a professor of Asian American Studies at San Francisco State University. He gives this quote about why the Chinese virus and subsequent hate speech has been a problem. Quote, it gives people license to attack us. The current spate of attacks on our elderly is part of how that rhetoric has impacted the broader population. I mean, I find that very frightening, that, that elders are being attacked over a president's rhetoric. There's something about that is so unseemly, so wrong on so many levels. And I have to say again, last late summer, last fall, I really didn't hear a lot of MSNBC, CNN, whatever, people really grinding on this issue to find some solutions. Is the fourth, Crystal, in your mind, is the fourth estate somewhat of a problem on this issue as well?
I think it's it goes back to, I know that the media, especially being a person in the media, I understand that the visibility, you don't know if a story is a story unless somebody speaks up about it.
Right.
And so I think our communities are also responsible for not speaking enough about it, especially since, I was reading a couple articles on what's been happening, is that it's the younger generation that has been actually standing up and filming some of these terrorist acts, or these horrible acts of violence, because they were willing to pull out their cell phone. And the generational gaps that we have, especially with our seniors. And it genuinely breaks my heart that our seniors don't feel like they should speak up until it's absolutely at the end, or it might be too late. They might be gone. And so, and also too, this whole rhetoric of the Chinese virus always just pisses me off beyond belief, because it created an opportunity where it's not just Chinese, it's everybody in the Asian community, that it opened the door for that type of negative racism and rhetoric, where Asian restaurants in Rio Rancho were getting phone calls from the public because they said, close down your doors because you guys are causing the virus. Even Filipinos, we're not really very close to China, or even, that we are in relationship to the continent, but it was just really frustrating that even Filipinos felt threatened to be Asian. And I think what's the most unfortunate part for me is that we are always very proud to be different. We are very proud to be Filipino. We're very proud to be Japanese, or whatever our culture might be. And that wording, a Chinese virus, gives us doubt to be proud of who we are. I hate that. And I want to change that mindset tomorrow. Yeah. Now, even.
Sachi Watasi and Crystal Ciarza, thank you both so much for spending some time on this. This is going to be a continuing discussion. This is not a one-time deal. Obviously, this is not going to go away after this segment, so we need to stay on top of this here at New Mexico PBS as well. So thank you both, though, for spending some time in educating us on this issue.
Thanks, Gene.
Absolutely. Embracing diversity is also important in local news coverage, and it's not just about the voices and faces you see and hear on your TV screens, or read on your favorite website, or in your local paper. I recently had the chance to sit down over Zoom with Albuquerque's first African-American president and general manager at a major television station. That's Lori Walden of KOAT7, to discuss the importance of who tells our stories and what that says about our communities. As an African-American woman coming up in the business, you were a poli-sci major in college. Talk about the challenges you faced early as a Black woman in this business.
Oh, yeah. It's funny, that was a long time ago when I started,
Sure.
And yet there are things that I still think about.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Eugene, I would say that it's hard because you walk into a place and you want to know that you're always being given the benefit of the doubt.
Mm-hmm.
But I found myself always having to feel like I had to be 3 times as good to get half as much. You walk into rooms, you walk into situations wearing armor because you feel like you have to always be the strongest in the room and the best.
Mm-hmm.
And I also think that I ran into different kinds of issues because in a newsroom, you will see African-American reporters or reporters of color. What you don't always see are African-Americans in management positions. And
Right.
so I found myself by myself. And when you sit at that table, I was often the only African-American at that table. Not at that point the head of the table, just the only one at the table. And so I would hear something, challenge it maybe, and I would get challenged. And it's hard being the only one at the table when you feel like your voice is alone.
Yeah.
But little by little, I was lucky because I had bosses who, I had some bad bosses, I won't lie, but I also had some good bosses who heard my voice and wanted to elevate me. But it wasn't just making sure that voices are heard, but how are we telling those stories? Who's being hired to tell those stories? And that's how I knew that I wanted to go into management, because while we may get to the table, we didn't have people of color who were at the heads of the table. And I thought that was important.
That's a big distinction, isn't it? You know, 'cause it's one thing to be able to speak up in a situation. It's another thing to put things in action or put things in motion.
That's right.
And that's a whole other thing. I couldn't agree with that more. You know, interestingly, when I think about the markets you've been in as well, I have to say this. I have to think you're as a Black woman, you're coming into this pretty battle hardened. I mean, Sacramento, and you know, you know what I mean.
Yeah.
You know, 10 feet tall and bulletproof at this point. You know, so
Well,
but does that help? You know,
it does.
Yeah,
It does. That's it does. Having the experience does help. Having lived in different places, not only as a news director, but I've lived all over the country. So as a reporter, I started out in Peoria, and then I moved to Mobile and to Charlotte and to the Bay Area and to Sacramento and to Milwaukee and to here. So I've been in different markets, pretty much all over the country. And so that's given me, some experience. I would also say that I'm not as young anymore, so I understand, some of the lessons. But if I could talk to my 20-year-old self or 25-year-old self, there are things that I've learned along the way that I think have helped me. And I would also say this too. It's why I also know that I can stand in a room and be the only and feel confident, because I've been there and I know, you can challenge me, but I know what I'm talking about. I've been to these newsrooms. We've won awards. We've won ratings. I know what we're talking about. So there's credibility there, which I think helps me as well.
that's right. And people pick up on that kind of thing. You know what I mean? When someone's really been around in this, people pick up on that kind of thing.
Yeah.
You know, what's the biggest challenge you see for Black reporters that either have worked under you, or it doesn't necessarily have to be under you? There's always that it's almost like teachers. The big problem for teachers is dropping out in the first year. That's where a lot of teachers, and I have to think journalists of color, it's so jolting to be in a newsroom and be the only one. And people dropping out of the business after a short period of time is a difficulty.
It is.
What are you seeing out there for difficulties for young reporters?
I think a lot of times, kind of what I mentioned before, about, first of all, just when you're the only in a room, people look at you differently.
Mhm.
And unfortunately, sometimes there's a level of, can you do this? It's finding yourself in positions where you want to pitch stories, and you know that they're important stories, but you don't always get buy-in from the people who are above you. Or sometimes it could be relegated to certain stories, but I want to cover that. Why don't you cover this? When reporters are starting out, oftentimes they start out in very small markets. That's very typical. And a lot of times these really tiny markets, there aren't a lot of people of color in those communities. And so there's a feeling of isolation, let alone the stories that you think you should be doing. So I think that's different. I think also just keeping young reporters in the business. It's not, you don't go into journalism a lot of times for the paycheck, or even into broadcasting. You go because it's a calling. So it's keeping the people who are doing well in the business. I think that's a challenge too. And also I would just say overall, especially reporters of color, just reminding them that their voices are important and that they may run up against obstacles when it comes to wanting to do the kinds of stories or voicing concerns, and not to be discouraged if you aren't getting the kind of attention that you should be. I think is a challenge as well.
Right. You've been a news director, as you mentioned in your career. A huge bit I want to talk about here for a second, because that's an enormous power position in a newsroom. I mean, really you get to say yes or no, basically. Right. There are not many positions where a Black person gets to say yes or no. And that's the final word, by the way, that yes or no. That's a very rare thing.
Right.
Is there a certain skill set, it seems to you, and you've witnessed in your journey, to be able to take that step up into management? What does one have to be able to be a news director of any color and be successful at it?
One of the things that I was very proud of, that when bosses promoted me, they said that I had two things that helped me to succeed and why I was promoted. And there are two passions that I have. First of all, I was told, and I'm just a good newswoman. I just love news. I love news. I love the craft of news. I love marrying wonderful words and pictures. I love great storytelling. I love drilling down. I like asking questions. I like being a critical thinker, which I think is important. I see myself as the viewer. I am the viewer. I am the advocate for the viewer. I heard a wonderful saying, we don't produce for the newsroom, we produce for the living room. So it's remembering that. So I just loved news. Local, national, global, I didn't care. I saw that as my calling, and that was my passion. And that's how I built my teams in the newsroom. And then the second thing, I laugh because it's something I just dearly love, but it's odd, I know, but I love managing people. I love leading people. I love building teams. I see myself as the coach. I see myself as the head coach. And so when I look at how do you cover breaking news wonderfully, how do you cover investigative, it starts with the people that you hire. And you're good to them. And I find that when you're good to your people, they are good to you. And when you get out of their way and you give them the tools that they need, and you recognize where they are strong, they do great work. And when they do great work, they're energized. And when they're energized, the work reflects that. So I would try to bring that spirit into the leadership positions that I've been in. And it's been successful, but again, it's also something that I love. So being a good news person, and I think being good with building teams is important.
It's that foundational thing, right? Everything has to have a foundation to build on. That's for sure. Right. One of the problems when you're a minority in a newsroom is having someone who has your back, basically. Right. And let me kind of put it this way. In a lot of endeavors out there, there's a lot of bosses who are willing to let you fail. So you can grow from it. But in a lot of cases, when you're the minority, you don't get that feeling. If you fail, you just fail.
Right.
It's viewed differently. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Difficulty. So how important, I'm back in the idea of management and the idea of being that voice in the room and say, okay, this reporter may have missed it on this one just by a little bit, but I think there's something we can work with here. Let's all not panic. Let's just do a little training over the next 6 months, whatever the case may be.
Yeah.
How important is that for someone to have someone at their back like that?
It's very important. It's very important. Failure is a great teacher. Failure is a great teacher. We all learn from failure. But when you're a person of color, you don't feel like you have that luxury. I don't have the luxury to fail because everyone's looking at me. I'm automatically in a spotlight. And so I had to walk into a room and be the biggest, forgive my language, badass in the room. I don't have the luxury to fail because there are people who will, if I do, may assume, she wasn't going to make it anyway. And so I never felt that way. And so as a news director, I always wanted to have the best ratings or award winning, or you just feel like you have to. But I have also had bosses who, when I have fallen short, because that's how you learn, they were good enough to say, but that's okay. What did you learn from it? What did you learn from it? And that's how I also try to manage as well. But I have to say, I understand that in theory and I get it. But I do think when you're a person of color, that's something that's always in the back of your mind. I don't want to fail. I don't want to fail because people may think I'm going to, or they may expect it. And it's not fair, but it's often the way it is.
Right, exactly right. My frustration since the 90s, or 1995 specifically, how we're tracking hiring for Black people in newsrooms has been sort of an up and down thing, but not a whole lot of progress. Do you have a crystal ball personally? Are you optimistic about the more Black representation? Do you see positive signs in the news business?
I do. Here's where I think the good news, and then I would say where I'm a little bit, I won't say concerned, but I'm watching very carefully. Even before George Floyd, even before all of the things that happened last year, and I mentioned this in the article. Stations know that it is important for their personnel on camera and off camera to reflect the communities that they serve. So it is good business and smart business to have a diverse workforce in stations, newsrooms, and otherwise. I think that after George Floyd, it became, there was a big light. We shined a light on that, and so it was even more important. But it's always been important. That's the good news. So I think that's the good news. What I am concerned about is it's important right now, but it's always been important. But there's a lot of attention to it. What I am concerned about is what are things going to look like in a year, and is there still going to be this level of engagement? Is there still going to be this level of aggressiveness in hiring? We don't want this to be the flavor of the month. It's got to be ongoing. And it's not just because, there's a light shining on us and people are going to notice that we don't have a diverse workforce at stations. It's the right thing to do. It is the right thing to do. When you have a diverse workplace, you are richer, you are smarter, you are better thinkers. And so it benefits all of us. So I know it's very top of mind for most media companies, as it always should be. But I'm just hoping that it doesn't die down in a year when other things capture our attention.
It's not just Black representation in the newsroom, Native American, Asian American representation.
We have to. And recruiting has been interesting because a lot of people don't know about New Mexico. And so we educate them, because people haven't always been out this way. But it's so important that we are diverse. And, I'll be honest, when I got here, I didn't see as much diversity as I thought that I would. Right. And that was one of the things that I knew, we got to rethink this because that's not who we are as a state or as a country.
I got another question about Black-owned media and small Black-owned media. And I've always had this thought that maybe, here in Albuquerque, we're not a huge part of the population, meaning African Americans, right. But there is the opportunity as well. Meaning we've had Ronnie Wallace has been here for years, running a Black publication for over 25 years now. but it might be time for perhaps some younger bucks to get in the game and really get that
Why
juice
not?
going in the neighborhood. Do you see some of that happening around the country? Are you supportive of that idea as well?
Oh, very supportive. Very
Yeah.
supportive. You know, it's a challenge because I think the desire to do it,
Mhm.
I think the stories and content are absolutely there. A lot of times it's a matter of economics.
Mhm.
And I think that has to do that influences whoever wants to start a publication, you know. But I do think that their time is right, and I do think that their desire is there, and I
Mhm.
do think that the journalists are there, and I think the people who can put these together are there.
Right.
So there's a lot of entrepreneurial, a big spirit that's going on with entrepreneurs, especially when they're seeing that mainstream media doesn't satisfy what they're interested in and what they think others are interested in. And so they're going out and forging their own way to create these new ways, these new platforms, and new streams of content, which I think is really exciting.
You know, you've been here a while now, and I'm sure it's no surprise that the complicated nature of our history, there's a lot of different tensions and backgrounds and historical things that inform a lot of New Mexico culture here. And it takes a little while to parse out sometimes when you're from the outside. I'm from the outside. I've been here 30 plus years, and I'm still trying to parse a lot of things out.
Yeah.
You know, a lot of difficulties. How challenging has that been for you to kind of get a sense in your arms around New Mexico and the complexities here?
It has been challenging, but in a good way.
Okay.
You're absolutely right. I mean, I've learned that that there is a complicated history to this state, and especially when the statue was toppled.
Yes.
So that brought up a lot, and so I
Yeah.
learned about that, and I've been trying to learn the history, contentious history, and trying to understand why when we do a story, we get this kind of response. Some of my biggest educators, I have to say, and sometimes it's difficult, are some of our viewers. Where when we do a story, they will respond, and it can be positive or negative. And if it's negative, I try to understand where are they coming from. And
Right.
some are just, let me explain why some of us didn't like this. And it's very educational.
Mhm.
There are others who are just kind of angry and nasty. And I have to take that in stride and understand, okay, here's why it's going the way it's going. Some of it has been about culture,
Mhm.
but quite frankly, some of it has been political because we are coming through some contentious times, especially last year.
Right.
But it's a complicated history, but I also find that there's a lot of beauty in this state, which I have enjoyed learning about, and the people. I've enjoyed it. I've enjoyed it.
When you start digging into it, it takes your breath away. I just have to say that personally. It really, there's a point, I think I was about 10 years in, and I was like, wow, this is an amazingly complicated
It
place.
is complicated.
Really, a decade later, you know what I mean?
It is
It's-
complicated.
But that's part of our charm and our strength, of course, as you've realized as well. That we
Exactly.
here that is like a mesh screen that's all tied together.
Yep.
I can't thank you enough, Lori, for spending some time with us here.
I
tonight.
love this.
Yeah.
This is my favorite. I forget we're live. I feel like I'm just having a good conversation over lunch. This is great.
I love it. Some good news to wrap up this week's show. The UNM Hospital was recently certified as a comprehensive stroke center. It's the first in the state and can make a big difference in providing quick and effective treatment for one of our biggest killers. Research shows that strokes are responsible for 1 in every 6 deaths in the United States. I recently reached out to some of the folks behind this new certification at UNMH to find out more about what it all means for patients, not just in Albuquerque, but across New Mexico. Guys, thank you all for joining us. I really appreciate it. Andrew, let me start with you, if I might. I'm not going by order of importance, just by who's on my screen as I look down and see. But talk about the accreditation, if you would, what it involved, why this was a years-long program, and what it means for the state to finally receive it.
Alphabetical helps sometimes, I guess.
Right.
So I'm a neurosurgeon. I treat mostly blood vessel problems, and I do treatments of blood vessel kind of things, both inside the blood vessels, what we call endovascular therapy, and when surgery is needed. And so I'm the surgical director of the stroke program, and Michelle is the medical director of the stroke program. And this really is a collaborative effort where a number of different disciplines need to work together to treat this complex problem of stroke. Why this is exciting for the state is because it recognizes the high level of care that we can provide to patients with the most complex and the most debilitating kinds of strokes. It recognizes our ability to work very quickly to get the right treatments to patients, whether that's giving patients medication or whether that's very quickly getting them into our angiography suite to be able to remove clots from the brain. And we know based on a lot of studies that have come out recently that stroke treatment has really changed over the last few years. We now can really, really improve the chances that somebody will have a good outcome after stroke. And so that's where this effort is incredibly important for New Mexico, because we have to be fast about it. And so trying to streamline all those processes, trying to streamline the groups that are working together to take care of these patients, and then, of course, extending that outreach across the rest of the state, which I think we'll talk about a little bit more later. But in order to get patients all over the state to be able to have access to that high level care is really what the core of the comprehensive stroke designation is for us.
Gotcha. Torsten Roed, as I read it, you've been on this trail literally for a long time in your career. And why is it important for everyday New Mexicans to have this stroke center? Obviously, Andrew touched on this a little bit, but when time is an issue when it comes to strokes, why this center? Why the importance?
Well, the big deal there is that we are the only, at this time, but the first comprehensive stroke center, which means, as Dr. Carlson already pointed out, we can do some of the things that no other center in the state can do. We can do, of course, the thrombectomies. You talked about the mechanical removing of clots, but then also any kind of follow-up problems. If the patient has bleeds in the head, the neurosurgery part of it. So the big issue there is that these patients that Dr. Carlson described, the really debilitating strokes, should, if at all possible, come to us directly. That's really the big difference. So they might even have to bypass a hospital that's a little closer, but doesn't have the capabilities. So that's something that the state has to understand, and that we're talking with EMS, and that these patients then come to us, and we can take care of them from the moment they arrive to all the way till they're discharged. So that includes our neurosurgery ICU unit. So that's also unique in the state. So the nursing care, the level of nursing care they receive, the constant availability of 24/7 of doctors, of neurosurgeons, of neurologists, everybody's here basically around the clock. And that's something that's quite unique in the state.
Yeah. I'm going to guess you've seen sort of both sides of this, meaning how we've done it to this point and what you anticipate being able to do better under this designation. Am I following that correctly?
Yes, of course. I mean, with Dr. Carlson coming back, our level of care would jumped up years and years ago already, and now we just got finally the title that shows that we have this level of capabilities that we've actually already had for a few years now. I did see it before. I see it in my own family. My grandma had strokes, and that was debilitating, right? Months and months and months of rehab to get speech back. And when you see some of these patients come in with these devastating diagnoses, and then sometimes walk out in a few days later after we treated them, that's just something that is very special that you don't see in many other disciplines.
That is interesting. I'm glad you got that in. That is actually fascinating. Dr. Torby, Michael Torby, you're a stroke specialist and chair of the Department of Neurology. Let's get into access to critical cerebral emergency support services, or ACCESS telemedicine program. Tell us about ACCESS and what it does.
So thank you, Gene. The UNM ACCESS program is our teleneurology platform, or emergency teleneurology platform, and it's currently present in more than 20 hospitals in rural New Mexico. When you think of New Mexico and you think of how the hospitals are dispersed, and as you mentioned earlier, time is brain, it makes it very challenging to bring all these patients to the main hospitals in the big cities so they could receive the care certainly makes it challenging to bring them all to one comprehensive stroke center and be able to then triage and try to figure out the best treatment. Mm-hmm. And then if you realize that, well, maybe this is not a stroke, now these patients are 2 hours away from home, no transportation, and it becomes a big challenge and financial issue. So what Access allows us to do is we're able to beam in literally to these emergency rooms and examine these patients live and assess their symptoms and look at their imaging and decide whether indeed they're having a stroke, and then what type of strokes are having. Are they having an ischemic stroke where you have a blood vessels that's occluded, or are you having a hemorrhagic stroke where you have a blood vessel that bursts? Right. And then if not, then they could stay in their local hospitals and don't need to come all the way. So this really allows us to also provide the right treatment right at the bedside. So for those patients who are having an acute stroke, we are able to give them the clot-busting medication at the bedside in the facility within the same speed that we would give them if they came immediately to our hospital. So you're elevating that level of care to almost a stroke center level of care, but then they need the next follow-up, which is now potentially taking the clot out, or they may need to come to the ICU. So you're really bringing the right patient to the right place in the right time. I think this combination is what makes it very successful as we treat the acute stroke patient. And if it's a hemorrhage patient, then, we already know that this patient is coming. The angio suite may be ready for the aneurysm coiling, or the ICU is ready for this patient. So you're really expediting the care across the board. And the Access Center is currently covered for all stroke patients by, our stroke team. Neurosurgery is also, covering for the neurosurgical emergency. And this is the way we connect the state and avoid unnecessary expensive transport, as you know.
Dr. Carlson, you touched on this just a little bit ago, and Dr. Torby just did a second ago as well, the new technologies that are out there. I have to say, as a layperson, I'm rather blown away watching video of going through a vein in the leg, coming all the way up into your brain, to be able to reach another thing inside that tube to yank a smaller clot out. It's astounding, actually. Talk about the leaps that have been made over the past years and how this is accomplished.
Yeah, it really is exciting. I agree. I've only been out of training for 8 years doing this, and even in that time, the field has just remarkably changed in terms of what we're able to do through very minimally invasive and very safe approaches. And I think that, as Dr. Torbay mentioned, it's important to remember that there are 2 general categories of stroke. We have bleeding types of stroke, hemorrhagic stroke, and we have ischemic stroke, which means a blood vessel gets blocked off. And our ability to treat both of those things has just skyrocketed. So our ability to treat blood vessel ruptures, where something like an aneurysm bursts and cause bleeding in the brain, most of those cases we're able to now treat up through the leg, or sometimes even up through the wrist through just a tiny needle puncture, and be able to put a device or little metal coils or loops into the burst point and seal everything up, which is obviously a much less invasive approach than when we have to do surgery to put metal clips to seal those. But for ischemic stroke, this is really where things have revolutionized the field, just because it's so much more common. It's the most common type of stroke. And when a blood vessel gets blocked off, like the carotid artery or one of the main blood vessels going out to the side of the brain from a clot that comes from the heart or comes from the neck somewhere, exactly as you said, we're able to thread tiny tubes all the way up using just x-rays from a puncture in the leg, and then either retrieve that clot with a little net, or sometimes even put a little suction right up to the clot and suck it out of there. If needed, we can open up the blood vessel and keep it open with a stent. And that's a proven treatment where we know that if we do that treatment for people who have blocked off blood vessels and still have brain that we can save, that there's a very good chance that we'll be able to get somebody not just to survive, but actually to have a good outcome. which is really what's different here. We're not talking about just making somebody survive, but in a severely debilitated state. We can actually make more people be able to be interactive, be able to be communicative, and be able to take care of themselves compared to if we couldn't do that treatment. So that's what's really exciting about the technological advances.
That's amazing. That's really through the wrist. That's amazing. Torsten Rhodes, what's the window now, as Dr. Carlson describes it? My understanding as a layperson is about 4 to 4.5 hours. You don't want to push it, obviously up to 4.5 hours, but what's the window? Has it narrowed in a way that you can get folks into a better recovery position?
Well, actually, we're working on extending those windows, right? So for the clot busting medication, TPA or Alteplase, there's a couple of them out there. Our standard number is 3 hours, but we can extend this to 4.5. That's the number you have. Now, for the technology that Dr. Carlson is describing, we're looking at a 24-hour window. That still can be very effective, and maybe even depending on the situation, looking at stretching that. There are other ways. The one stroke that always confounded us is a wake up stroke, right? Person goes to back normal, wakes up 8 hours later and has a stroke, and now we don't know when the stroke happened, so we always have to assume the last normal when it was seen the last time. And but there's even talk about looking at that and extending those windows. So it's moving in the direction of more intervention at later stages. But I'll let the doctors talk about that even more.
Yeah. Torsten, let me stay with you on this one, though. We should get into, again, another reminder for folks about what to look for in a stroke if you're out in public with your friends and family. I've been in two situations. Both of them were cookouts, believe it or not, over the years, where there was a stroke situation. One was quite obvious and quite severe, but the other one, we literally had to talk the person. I wasn't part of this, but the person had to be talked into going to the hospital because they were, I feel all right. I just was sort of lightheaded. Well, a week later, it turned out they did have a small stroke.
Yes.
How often does that happen where people feel like they're just a little bit off, but they don't feel like they need to take that next step, and they don't realize that something very serious is going on here?
Well, you make a great point. Education about that is probably one of our most important steps. So the recognition of the stroke, and especially now in this new world we're living with COVID, and people are afraid of going out. People are afraid going to the hospital. We had for a while concerns that people with slight symptoms decided not to go to the hospital because they were afraid of. So we had public announcements about that. So the mnemonic is, of course, is be fast that we're using. B is for balance. When you're suddenly off balance and you can't stand up, that might be a stroke symptoms. Eye deviation, when your eyes can't really look where you want them to. And then the obvious ones that we know for a long time, the facial droop. That's often the one that family recognizes. Mom, suddenly the one side of the face just falling. Then we have the arm that you can't move part of your body, usually the side that's opposite from what's affected in the brain. Speech, that's a big one too. That's actually the one that I would think that you talked earlier about people being at home and being alone.
Yes.
When you can suddenly get your words out, that's a big indication, and you do need to call if you can. And then the last one for be fast is time, right? Time is brain, as Dr. Torbe said. So we are recommending even slight symptoms. If you have a speech problem suddenly onset, or you're definitely facial droop, but even if your balance is off, do come in, let us look at you, let us scan you, and then these guys here on my right will be able to tell you what's going on.
Interesting. I have an aunt, she's long past now. She was the victim of a stroke. No one had gotten to her for a number of hours, and regrettably, she lived out the last 7 years of her life just not in a great place. It was really just not a good situation. And this, I've always gotten the feeling this is way more common than people realize. Like, this is like sort of like the silent thing. We talk about silent killers, all that kind of thing. The problem with stroke is, there's a diminished life that happens sometimes when you do recover. And how to get across the seriousness of that. that you may end up in a chair. You may end up not being able to feed yourself. I mean, just all, I don't mean to be dramatic here. Don't get me wrong, but there are serious implications for when a stroke is not caught that sometimes I feel like the public's not quite snapping to. Do you have a sense of that you can help me with on this one?
Yeah, no, Gene, I mean, this is really an important issue. And to kind of follow up on what Torsten mentioned, I mean, the big challenge, as you've noted in some of these cookout, is when the patient develops stroke symptoms and then the symptoms resolve completely. And this is what we call a TIA, or transient ischemic attack. At that stage, they feel they're fine and they don't want to go to the hospital. And it's important for patients to realize that their risk of a recurrent stroke is exactly the same, whether they had a TIA or a full big stroke that ended up by them needing to go to the hospital emergently. So this is what I tell my patient is this was your warning sign. And in a sense, it's important for you to go to the hospital to make sure that any problem is being addressed and fixed. And going to your question, a lot of it is because sometimes even in an acute setting, stroke is not a painful disease. Like when you're heart attack, you have the severe chest pain that radiating to your arm, and the reason you go to a hospital is mostly to get rid of the pain, not as much because of you think, oh, I'm having a heart attack, and it's unfortunate from a stroke perspective, but also to help them in the recovery, which is going to be as important as getting the stroke therapy. Because if you can get the best therapy, let's say at UNM, and now you're going to go to rehab, and then in the rehab facility, they're not working on your stroke as they need to. But also, if the patient isn't following the recommendation from their stroke rehab docs, all the work that we've done in the first 24, 48 hours for this amazing recovery, the patient could get step backs and not perform at 100%. So it's a continuum of care that we have to really work as a team across the board, and with the patient being the center of this whole sort of process, to work with them and educate them on what would be the best way to get the optimum recovery.
It's important. It's important for New Mexico with an aging population. It's kind of a big deal. So thanks, guys. I really appreciate your time today. Absolutely.
We appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you for having us, Gene.
My pleasure. If the last year has shown us anything, it's that our relationships with the people around us are more important than ever. I know for me, life in lockdown proved that no Zoom meeting or social media tweet up can replace the connection of in-person gatherings. And yet, in many ways, we seem to have a harder time as a society right now, just treating each other with the basic common courtesy. From cancel culture to social media spats, we seem to be in a constant struggle for common ground. But it's not too late to turn things around. If our stories this week teach us anything, it is that we will never regret taking the time to hear from people who are different than ourselves. And the key there is the listening part. If we can all do a little more of that in these months coming out of the pandemic, perhaps we can get back to a little more compassion and a lot more understanding. At least that's my hope. Thanks again for joining us and for staying informed and engaged. We'll see you again next week in Focus.
Funding for New Mexico in Focus provided by the McCune Charitable Foundation and viewers like you.